The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free.
Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Right now, I'm going to attempt to examine the Bible and dissect some of the churchy language that we can really easily take for granted, digging into history and languages when I'm able to try and get at the heart of the text so we can hopefully see and then apply some of what God has for us in these words today. Now, I'm not formally trained in Scripture. I'm just a guy using resources and a questioning mind to try and get at the truth. That's something that we can all do, so I hope that you're always doing that with me as we go through this series. We're in the book of James. We're still in chapter 1, and this time we're looking at verses 16 through 18 of chapter 1. In the ESV, that reads, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." Now, leading up to this point, James has been talking about the nature of trials. And in the verses immediately before these, he clarifies that God is not the source of our temptation, but rather we are tempted by our own internal desires. Verse 16 starts with the phrase, "Do not be deceived," which this was really interesting as I looked into this. In the Greek, it was a kind of phrase that you would use to set up a very important point. An equivalent today might be when we start a sentence by saying, "Make no mistake," and then we, say whatever we want to, be emphatic about. But the way this particular Greek phrase is formed here often implies the ones being addressed were actually already being deceived. So James may actually be starting this sentence with a phrase equivalent to "stop being deceived." That's not for sure, but it's a real possibility. Whether his audience was already being deceived or not, the specific deception being warned against is, as we look at the context, that of believing God could be a source of our temptation. As we saw in verses 13 through 15, he's dealing with that there. James contrasts and clarifies, saying in verse 17, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." His point here is that rather than being a source of evil or temptation, God is the source of every truly good and perfect gift we experience in life. This is a verse that I often point to when talking about various forms of entertainment that we enjoy. But of course, it extends to every good thing that we experience. Humans certainly mix in sin and corruption with much of what God has made. But the credit for any sin in the mix belongs to humans. The credit for any good in the mix ultimately belongs to God. And James wants to draw a very clear line between the two. James also emphasizes God's consistency in this. He is the Father of lights, as he's called here, which most likely refers to him being the creator of stars and planets in this context. Unlike the shadows, which change shape in relationship to those sources of light, God himself is the source of light and doesn't change at all. God is absolutely consistent in his character. We have no reason to ever fear or suspect otherwise. Looking at verse 18 now, which again says, "Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." The Greek here for "brought us forth" contains the idea of giving birth or bringing forth from the womb. Since God did this by the word of truth, it likely refers to the spiritual rebirth of James and his original audience. By saying that he and his audience were a kind of first fruits of God's creatures, he's implying that they represented like just the mere beginning of God's rescue plans for all of humanity. Okay, so having taken a look at those verses, what's in all this for geeks that we've read? Well, as I mentioned last time, a lot of geeks I've noticed have experienced and may still be experiencing trials, really difficult circumstances, and even outright suffering. trials do not necessarily indicate that the one suffering has sinned. I want to be clear about that. But James makes the source of sin and temptation a part of his context in talking about trials here, so we should factor that in and consider that, and maybe make some kind of comment on that. If a person can bring themselves to recognize sin that they have done that contributes to their trials, that's really good. But it's also easy to get just that far in the process of confession and self-examination, and then shift blame somewhere else. And in deep or prolonged suffering, it can feel very natural to shift blame to God, even blaming Him for our own sins. But God is never the cause of anyone's sin. In fact, even if the world seems to be falling into chaos around us, God is the one constant that will never change. Included in that, included in His unchanging nature, are His good and unstoppable purposes. James tells us that God is completely unchanging and that His plans for the ultimate rescue of humanity are in play even now in the context of our trials. I've seen lately an area of my life that I need to trust specifically the character of God in. So these verses have been well timed and important for me to hear, and I hope they've been valuable to you too.